The Eliani were arrogant enough to think they could force the Craxians to surrender. Then the humans arrived to help the Craxians crush the Eliani into dust. Niran's eyes narrowed as he watched the massive Craxian fleet emerge from FTL, an armada of warships blotting out the skies of the Eliani homeworld. The ruthless Craxians had spent 2 years enslaving every sentient species they encountered in a brutal war of conquest across the sector. The Eliani were the last free civilization still standing against the Craxian onslaught. Niran strode into the Eliani council chamber to deliver the dire news. "Our planetary defenses are crumbling," Niran said. "Craxian dropships have breached the atmosphere. Combat projections show they will overrun our forces within days." The council members shifted in their seats, scales rippling with unease. "Then we must activate Project Unity immediately," the council leader said. "It is our last hope." Niran suppressed a scoff. Project Unity was a desperate gamble, activating an ancient alien transmitter to broadcast a plea for aid to unknown civilizations. The Eliani had no idea if the device even worked. With Craxian troops already landing and the Eliani military in full retreat, Niran saw little choice. He input the final activation codes, not expecting an answer. Unbeknownst to the Eliani, their transmission reached a remote human listening post at the galaxy's edge. Upon hearing the Eliani's plight, the human commander grinned. At last, a chance for humanity to conquer new worlds under the guise of liberation. The humans would answer the Eliani's call, but not as saviors, as conquerors. James Johnson wiped sweat from his brow as he stood before the alien obelisk, its surface etched with inscrutable glyphs. His team of xenoarchaeologists had spent weeks studying the ruins on Zathora, but this discovery eclipsed anything they'd found so far. "Any idea what it says?" his assistant Mike asked. Johnson shook his head. "Not a clue. But look at the craftsmanship. The Eliani built this eons ago, and it's still standing." Suddenly, the obelisk crackled with energy, blue sparks dancing across its surface. The team stepped back, shielding their eyes as a hologram flickered to life above the ancient device. The image resolved into a scaled alien in ornate robes, desperation etched into his features. "To any who receive this message, I am Commander Niran of the Eliani. Our civilization faces annihilation at the hands of the Craxian invaders. We beseech you, aid us in our darkest hour." Johnson's blood ran cold. He knew the Craxians all too well. Years ago, when he was still a space marine, his unit had responded to a distress call from a human colony. They arrived to find the settlement in ruins, its inhabitants either dead or dragged away in chains by Craxian slavers. The memory of that slaughter still haunted him. He turned to his team. "Pack up the gear, we're leaving!" "But the ruins," Mike protested. "The ruins will still be here. The Eliani won't." Johnson strode towards their shuttle, already activating his comlink. "This is James Johnson to any human ships in range. The Eliani are under attack by the Craxians. They need our help." Responses crackled back immediately. A freighter captain, a luxury yacht owner, a dozen others. Within minutes a plan took shape. They would rendezvous at the nearest human outpost, gather what ships and weapons they could, and set out for Eliani space. As Johnson's shuttle lifted off, he caught a final glimpse of the obelisk, still glowing with the ghostly image of Commander Niran. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're coming." The ragtag human fleet dropped out of FTL on the fringes of the Eliani system, a motley assortment of vessels united by a common purpose. Ahead, the Craxian armada swarmed around the Eliani homeworld, their ships raining fire onto the planet's surface. Johnson, standing on the bridge of a hastily retrofitted cargo hauler, clenched his fists as he watched Eliani ships burn in the skies. "Open a channel to the Craxians," he ordered. The comms officer nodded, fingers flying over her console. "Channel open." "Craxian vessels, this is James Johnson of the Earth Defense Fleet. Withdraw from Eliani space immediately or be destroyed." A harsh, guttural laugh filled the bridge. "Puny humans?" a Craxian voice rasped. "You dare to challenge us? Your pitiful ships are no match for our might." Johnson smiled grimly. "We'll see about that. All ships engage the enemy. For Earth and the Iliani." As one, the human fleet surged forward, weapons bristling from every hull. The Craxians turned to face them, their laughter turning to snarls of rage. And with a flash of fire and a rumble that shook the stars, the battle for the Iliani homeworld began. The human fleet hurtled into the fray, weapons blazing as they faced down the Craxian armada. Craxian plasma bolts sliced through the void, ripping into human shields and armor. The modified freighter, Horizon's Dawn, shuddered as a searing beam punctured its hull, venting atmosphere and crew into the pitiless void. "Keep firing," Captain Amelia Vance shouted over the klaxons. Her ship was never meant for this, but she'd be damned if she let the Craxians win without a fight. All across the ragtag human fleet, it was the same story. Outgunned and outmatched, but unwilling to back down. A sleek yacht wove between the lumbering Craxian battleships, pummeling their flanks with torpedoes. A bulky ore hauler rammed a Craxian frigate, consigning both ships to a fiery grave. On the surface of the Iliani homeworld, the streets of the capital rang with the clash of arms and the cries of the wounded. Craxian warriors surged forward, their chitinous armor glistening under the alien sun. Iliani defenders fell back, their lines buckling under the relentless onslaught. In the midst of the chaos, Commander Niran rallied his troops for a final stand. "Hold fast," he roared, his plasma rifle spitting blue fire. "We will not let our world fall." But even as he spoke, he could see the despair in his soldiers' eyes. They were out of time, out of hope. The Craxians sensed victory and pressed their attack, heedless of their mounting losses. Just as all seemed lost, a new sound filled the air, the roar of dropship engines. Niran looked up to see human vessels screaming down from the sky, their hulls scorched from the battle above. The dropships hit the ground hard, ramps slamming down to disgorge armored figures. Human marines clad in power armor and wielding weapons that made the Iliani's rifles look like children's toys. At their head strode a warrior with a grinning skull emblazoned on his breastplate, James Johnson. He leveled his plasma rifle and charged, a battle cry on his lips. The Marines smashed into the Craxian lines like a thunderbolt. Their railguns punched through chitin and flesh, while streams of plasma turned the insectoid warriors to ash. Ichor sprayed and Craxians fell, their advance faltering in the face of this new threat. Niran found himself fighting side by side with Johnson, the two warriors falling into a deadly rhythm. For every Iliani that fell, a dozen Craxians joined them in death. The tide was turning. High above, the battle had reached a critical juncture. The human fleet had been reduced to a handful of battered ships, but they had taken a fearsome toll on the Craxians. Gutted hulks and expanding clouds of debris littered the void. Amelia Vance gritted her teeth as another Craxian salvo hammered her ship. Alarms blared and consoles sparked, but she held her course. They just needed to hold out a little longer. Suddenly new contacts lit up her display. Ships, human ships, translating in from FTL. Johnson had sent out a call before the battle, and now the cavalry had arrived. A cheer went up from the bridge crew as they saw the reinforcements, a fresh wave of human vessels led by a massive dreadnought. The new arrivals ploughed into the Craxian rear, catching the insectoid ships in a devastating crossfire. The Craxian fleet, already battered and bloodied, came apart like a rotten log. Ships fell by the dozen, torn apart by human guns. On the planet below, the last Craxian forces fled the capital, harried by Johnson and Niran's troops. The Iliani cheered their saviors, hailing the humans as heroes. But even as they celebrated, a chill fell over the gathering. Intercepted transmissions painted a grim picture. This was just the vanguard, a mere fraction of the Craxian war machine. The bulk of their conquest fleet was still en route, an armada that would dwarf the force they had just faced. They had days, perhaps less, before the real storm hit. Johnson and Niran shared a somber look, the elation of victory fading fast. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning, and this time there would be no retreat, no surrender. They would fight to the last for the fate of the Eleani and the galaxy itself. Johnson and Niran huddled over a holographic display of the Eleani system, the approaching Craxian fleet, a swarm of angry red dots at the edge of the projection. The losses from the previous battle were stark. The human fleet had been reduced to a handful of ships, while the Eleani navy was little more than scattered debris. "We can't beat them head-on," Johnson said, his face grim. "Not with what we have left." Niran's scales rippled with frustration. "My people are brave, but we're not miracle workers. We need a weapon that can turn the tide." They pored over the Eleani archives, searching for anything that could give them an edge. It was Niran who found it, buried in a centuries-old military report. "The Starfire cannon," he breathed. "A weapon of immense power, capable of destroying entire fleets." Johnson leaned in, his eyes scanning the ancient text. "Says here it was dismantled, deemed too unstable. The components were hidden on 3 different worlds." They locked eyes, the same desperate plan forming in their minds: reassemble the Starfire cannon and use it to annihilate the Craxians. The planning session was swift and urgent. They divided their meager forces into 3 teams, each tasked with recovering a vital piece of the cannon. Johnson volunteered to lead the first team. Their target, the toxic jungles of Vensar, where the cannon's power core lay hidden. As their dropship hurtled through the planet's noxious atmosphere, Johnson checked his weapon for the 100th time. The jungle was a green hell, the air thick with choking spores and the cries of unseen predators. Craxian scouts harried them at every turn, bursts of plasma sizzling through the undergrowth. But Johnson's team pushed forward, driven by grim determination. They found the bunker deep underground, its entrance choked with twisting vines. As Johnson wrenched open the rusted door, a snarl echoed from the darkness within. He dove to the side as a monstrous creature lunged forth, all fangs and claws. Plasma fire lit up the gloom as Johnson's team battled the beast. It took a full power cell to bring the thing down, its carcass sizzling on the bunker floor. Johnson stepped over it, his eyes fixed on the pulsing blue sphere that could only be the power core. On Galaxy, Niran's team fought through the planet's endless storms. Wind and waves battered their small craft as they navigated towards the coordinates of a long-lost undersea city. Niran gripped the helm, his knuckles pale, as he guided them through the maelstrom. The city was a maze of crumbling spires and flooded halls, its ancient grandeur ravaged by the unrelenting sea. Niran's team swept through the ruins, scanners probing for the telltale signature of Eleani technology. A telltale ping led them to the central plaza, now playing host to a colossal crustacean. The monster scuttled forward, pincers the size of tanks snapping at the intruders. Niran led the charge, plasma rifle blazing. The cannon's targeting module lay in the creature's lair, encrusted with barnacles but intact. As Niran pried it free, he couldn't suppress a surge of hope. Perhaps they had a chance after all. Commander Sarah Briggs, Johnson's right hand, had arguably drawn the hardest mission. The wastelands of Ashfall were a hellscape of lava flows and choking ash, the air simmering with volcanic heat. Craxian drones swarmed like angry hornets, harrying her team as they trekked towards a massive lava fortress. Briggs gritted her teeth as a plasma bolt seared past her faceplate, close enough to scorch the paint. She returned fire, her railgun punching a hole clean through her attacker. All around her, the battle raged, human marines versus Craxian drones in a deadly dance. The fortress rose before them, a black citadel wreathed in smoke and flame. Craxian troops boiled out to meet them, plasma scythes humming. Briggs led the charge, her battle cry ringing out over the comm. The fighting was brutal and close, the air choked with ash and ionized plasma. But inch by bloody inch, Briggs and her marines pushed forward. The fortress shook as they breached the main gates, Craxian bodies piling high. At the heart of the citadel they found their prize, the Starfire cannon's firing mechanism, a complex array of lenses and emitters. Briggs cradled it like a newborn as they fought their way back to the extraction point. The mood was electric as the three teams rendezvoused back on the Eliani homeworld. Exhausted but triumphant, they watched as the Eliani engineers worked feverishly to assemble the cannon, welding and calibrating with desperate speed. The final piece slotted into place just as the long-range sensors lit up with dread warnings. The Craxian fleet had arrived, a swarm of cruel metal filling the skies. On the bridge of the human flagship, Johnson and Niran shared a look of grim resolve. The Starfire cannon rose before them, a spire of ancient might, bristling with new human weapons. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. As the Craxian ship swept towards them, Johnson's finger hovered over the firing key. He whispered a silent prayer to gods he had long since stopped believing in, and prepared to decide the fate of two species. The final battle was about to begin. The Craxian fleet surged forward, a seething mass of chitinous ships bristling with weapons. At the heart of the armada loomed the flagship, a monstrous dreadnought that dwarfed the largest human vessels. On its bridge stood Warlord Chrysax, his compound eyes glinting with malice as he surveyed the Allied forces arrayed before him. The humans and Eliani had taken up defensive positions around the Starfire cannon, the ancient weapon now mounted on a massive orbital platform. Eliani engineers had worked tirelessly to enhance its power and range, but it remained a temperamental and untested device. Johnson and Niran exchanged a tense look, knowing they would have only one chance to turn the tide of battle. Chrysax's voice crackled over the comm, his tone dripping with disdain. "Surrender now, and I will grant you a swift death. Resist, and you will beg for such mercy before the end." Johnson's response was to slam his fist on the firing controls, sending a salvo of missiles streaking towards the Craxian fleet. "We'll take our chances, Bug." The battle erupted in a maelstrom of fire and fury. The Allied fleet flew into action, fighters darting and weaving amidst the enemy ships like angry wasps. The capital ships exchanged brutal broadsides, the void lighting up with the flare of shields and the bloom of explosions. Despite their valor, the Allies were badly outmatched. Craxian plasma ripped through hull plating, while swarming attack craft overwhelmed point defenses. Ships died in droves, consigned to fiery oblivion. Amidst the chaos, Johnson and Niran spearheaded a desperate gambit. Leading a hand-picked team of elite warriors, they boarded an assault shuttle and knifed towards the Craxian flagship, determined to cut the head off the snake. They smashed through the docking bay in a hail of wreckage, disembarking with weapons blazing. Craxian warriors swarmed to meet them, plasma scythes humming. Johnson and Niran fought like men possessed, their power armor and advanced weapons more than a match for the insectoid horde. They blasted their way to the bridge, leaving a trail of shattered chitin and ichor in their wake. As they breached the final door, they came face to face with Chrysax himself. The warlord was a towering figure, his exoskeleton adorned with the trophies of 100 campaigns. "You dare," he hissed, drawing a crackling energy glaive. Johnson hefted his plasma rifle. "We dare." The two warriors clashed in a whirlwind of slashing blades and searing energy. Johnson was a veteran of countless battles, but Chrysax was a force of nature. They traded blows with lightning speed, armor sparking and weapons clashing. A sweeping cut from Chrysax's glaive carved a deep furrow across Johnson's chestplate, sending him staggering back. The warlord pressed his advantage, mandibles clacking in anticipation of the kill. But Johnson was not done. With a roar of defiance, he lunged inside Chrysax's guard, ramming his plasma rifle up under the warlord's chin. He pulled the trigger, and Chrysax's head exploded in a spray of chitin and ichor. As the warlord's corpse slumped to the deck, Niran was already at the control console. His fingers flew over the unfamiliar controls, rerouting power and disabling safeguards. The ship shuddered as its reactor began to overload. "Time to go," Niran yelled, and they sprinted for the shuttle bay. They barely made it aboard before the flagship exploded, the shockwave hurling them clear. But even this victory could not stem the tide. The Craxians continued their relentless advance, heedless of their losses. The Allied fleet was in tatters, ships falling by the score. On the orbital platform, Eliani engineers fought desperately to keep the Starfire cannon operational as it charged. Craxian ships swept in, pummeling the platform with plasma. Consoles exploded and fires raged, but the engineers held their ground, patching damage and rerouting power with grim determination. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a shout came over the comm. "The cannon is ready." Johnson didn't hesitate. "Fire!" A lance of blinding energy erupted from the cannon, a beam of pure destruction that cut through the Craxian fleet like a scythe through wheat. Dozens of ships simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant. Others were ripped apart by the shockwave, torn to shreds by forces beyond comprehension. The remaining Craxian ships, thrown into disarray by the devastating attack and the loss of their warlord, broke off and fled. The Allies had won. But as Johnson surveyed the battlefield, he felt no elation. The cost had been staggering. The wreckage of friendly ships drifted alongside the shattered hulks of Craxian vessels, a silent testament to the fallen. They had achieved victory, but at a price that could never be recouped. The war was over, but the scars it left would endure forever. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. As the smoke cleared and the fires died down, the true cost of their victory became apparent. The Eliani homeworld lay in ruins, its once proud cities reduced to rubble and ash. Over half the human fleet had been destroyed, and nearly 3/4 of the Eliani military had perished in the brutal fighting. Johnson stood amidst the wreckage, his armor battered and scorched. He watched as medics tended to the wounded, and crews searched for survivors in the debris. The scale of the destruction was staggering, but they had achieved what many thought impossible. They had defeated the Craxians and freed the Eliani from their tyranny. Niran approached, his own armor equally battle-worn. "We did it, Johnson. We won." Johnson nodded, his expression grim. "But at what cost? Look around you, Niran. Your people have paid a heavy price for this victory." "Freedom is never free," Niran said. "But thanks to you and your people, we have a chance to rebuild, to forge a better future." In the days that followed, recovery efforts began in earnest. Human and Eliani ships worked side by side to clear debris from orbit and provide aid to the survivors on the surface. Engineers and construction crews from both races labored tirelessly to restore power, rebuild infrastructure, and provide shelter for the displaced. Amidst the chaos, Johnson and Niran found themselves hailed as heroes. The Eliani High Council officially declared an alliance with the human government, cementing the bond that had been forged in battle. Ceremonies were held to honor the fallen and celebrate the victors. For a moment it seemed as though peace had finally come. But their respite was short-lived. Just a few weeks after the battle, long-range probes detected a massive Craxian armada entering the sector. It was a fleet that dwarfed the one they had just defeated, with thousands of ships and millions of troops. The Craxian Empire had taken notice of their defeat and was determined to crush this resistance once and for all. Faced with this overwhelming threat, Johnson and Niran knew they couldn't win alone. They convened an emergency meeting with the Eliani and human leaders, where a grim consensus was reached. If they were to have any chance of survival, they needed to unite the other races of the sector against the Craxians. And so Johnson and Niran embarked on a desperate diplomatic mission. They visited world after world, meeting with leaders and representatives of various species. Many were initially resistant, still bitter over past conflicts or fearful of Craxian retribution. But Johnson and Niran were relentless in their efforts. They argued, persuaded, and pleaded. They shared the story of their victory against the Craxians, emphasizing that it was only possible because humans and Eliani had worked together. They painted a grim picture of what would happen if the Craxians were allowed to conquer the sector unchallenged. Slowly but surely, their message began to resonate. Old rivalries and grudges were set aside in the face of annihilation. One by one, races that had once been enemies pledged their support. Ships and soldiers began to gather, forming the nucleus of a coalition fleet. At the core of this alliance were the humans and Eliani, the two races that had started it all. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of war, now served as a beacon of hope for the rest of the sector. Together, they worked to integrate the disparate forces into a cohesive fighting unit. As the Craxian armada drew closer, the Allied fleet assembled. It was a sight unlike any the sector had ever seen. Thousands of ships from a dozen different races, all united in common cause. There were sleek, human battle cruisers, bristling with weaponry. Eliani dreadnoughts, their hulls adorned with the scars of past battles, vessels from the insectoid Kilra, the avian Vox Ari, the crystalline Prism, and many more. Johnson stood on the bridge of the human flagship, watching as the fleet assumed formation. Niran stood beside him, his presence a constant reminder of how far they had come. In front of them, displayed on the main view screen, was the approaching Craxian armada. It was a sea of cruel metal, a seemingly endless swarm of ships that blotted out the stars. Johnson felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Niran, his expression one of grim determination. "This is it, my friend, the moment of truth." Johnson nodded, his own resolve hardening. "We've come too far to fail now. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." As the two fleets converged, the fate of the entire sector hung in the balance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered for generations. A battle that would decide the future of every race, every world, every soul in this corner of the galaxy. Johnson took a deep breath, his hand hovering over the weapons console. He looked out at the Allied fleet, at the thousands of ships and millions of beings ready to fight and die for their freedom. And he knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that they would prevail. They had to. For in this moment, in this place, they were more than just disparate races and cultures. They were a single united force, bound together by a common cause and an unbreakable will. They were the defenders of the innocent, the champions of the free. They were the ones who would stand against the darkness and say, "No more." Johnson and Niran huddled around the command console, eyes locked on the holographic display of the approaching Craxian armada. The Allied fleet hung in space around them, a motley assemblage of ships from a dozen different races, united by desperation and a common enemy. "There's too many of them," Johnson muttered, his fingers tightening on the edge of the console. "Even with every ship we've got, we can't take them head-on." Niran's brow furrowed in thought, then his eyes widened. "The obelisk, the one that summoned you and your people." Johnson turned to him, eyebrow raised. "What about it?" "It was able to reach across the stars, to pull your ships here in our hour of need. If it can do that, then maybe it can be used as a weapon," Johnson finished, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. They raced to the Eliani science vessel, where a team of Eliani and human engineers had been studying the ancient technology. The head scientist, an Eliani named Thalax, greeted them with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "We've been analyzing the obelisk's energy signature," Thalax explained, leading them into the lab. The obelisk stood in the center, surrounded by a web of cables and sensors. "We believe we can reconfigure it to create localized gravitational anomalies." "Gravity wells," Johnson said, "to trap their ships." "Precisely, but—" Thalax hesitated. "The technology is ancient and unpredictable. There's a risk it could destabilize or create an uncontrollable singularity." Niran and Johnson exchanged a glance. The Craxian fleet was drawing closer by the minute. It was a huge gamble, but what choice did they have? "Do it," Johnson said. The Allied fleet moved into position, forming a defensive perimeter around the Eliani science vessel. On the bridge of the human flagship, Johnson watched the Craxian armada approach, a swarm of cruel metal filling the view screen. "Steady," he murmured into the fleet-wide comm. "Draw them in." The Craxian ships came on, plasma cannons charging. The Allied fleet held their fire, a bait too tempting to resist. "Now," Johnson roared. On the science vessel, Thalax input the final command. The obelisk pulsed with blinding light. Then, in the heart of the Craxian formation, space itself seemed to twist and distort. Ships shuddered as the gravitational vortex took hold, their engines screaming as they fought against the inexorable pull. The Allied fleet opened fire, a hail of shells and energy bolts converging on the trapped Craxian vessels. Explosions bloomed in the void as ship after ship was torn apart. But the Craxians were quick to adapt. Their formation split, spreading out to minimize the effect of the gravity weapon. A squadron of Craxian destroyers broke away, diving towards the science vessel with guns blazing. "Protect that ship," Johnson barked. The Allied fleet moved to intercept a desperate defense against the Craxian onslaught. On the science vessel, warning lights flashed as the obelisk's energy readings spiked into the red. "It's destabilizing," Thalax shouted over the alarms. "We're losing control." Johnson gritted his teeth. They couldn't afford to lose the gravity weapon, but at this rate it would tear itself apart. Then an idea struck him. A desperate, reckless gamble. "Niran with me," he said, already moving towards the hangar bay. "We're going to board the Craxian command ship." "What?" Niran stared at him. "That's suicide." "If we can capture their leadership, force a surrender." Johnson met his gaze. "It's the only way." Niran held his eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Let's do it." They assembled a strike team of the best human and Eliani fighters, and launched in a squadron of boarding craft, screaming towards the Craxian command ship under the cover of the raging battle. They blasted their way into the hangar, met by a swarm of Craxian warriors. Plasma fire filled the air as they fought their way deeper into the ship, leaving a trail of broken insectoid bodies in their wake. On the bridge, they confronted the Craxian commanders, a trio of towering, heavily armored warriors. The battle was brutal and bloody. Johnson's team fell one by one, cut down by plasma fire or crushed by massive claws. But in the end, Johnson and Niran stood victorious. The Craxian leaders bound and subdued at their feet. "Broadcast a surrender order," Johnson panted, his armor scorched and dented. "Call off the attack." The Craxian commander, his compound eyes blazing with hate, spat a glob of ichor at Johnson's feet. "Craxians do not surrender, human. We do not stop, not until your worlds are ashes and your people are broken beneath our claws." Johnson's blood ran cold. He realized with sinking dread that even with their leaders captured, the Craxians would not stop. They would fight to the last, a fanatical devotion to conquest and slaughter. On the viewscreen, he saw the gravity weapon flare and pulse, space warping around it as it spiraled out of control. The Craxian fleet was in disarray, but still they came on, heedless of their losses, driven by a single-minded hunger for destruction. Johnson looked to Niran, saw the same grim realization in his eyes. They had played their last card and it wasn't enough. The battle still hung in the balance, and the fate of the sector with it. Niran slammed his fist on the console. "They're not just military leaders, Johnson. They're part of a cult, the Scourge of Stars." Johnson looked up from the plasma burns on his armor. "The what?" "A fanatical group that believes in Craxian supremacy. They're the ones behind all this brutality, all this senseless slaughter." The pieces fell into place in Johnson's mind. The Craxians' relentless aggression, their disregard for their own casualties. It all made sense now. "They'll never surrender, will they?" he said grimly. Niran shook his head. "Not as long as the Scourge holds power, but maybe we can change that." He explained his plan. They would hack into the Craxian communication network, broadcast the truth about the Scourge's atrocities to the Craxian people, incite a rebellion against the fanatical leaders. It was a long shot, but what choice did they have? They assembled a team. Eliani psionics to penetrate the Craxian psychic defenses, human hackers to slice through their computer systems. Johnson and Niran led the infiltration, fighting their way to a Craxian comms relay. The hackers went to work, their fingers flying over the alien interfaces. The psionics delved into the Craxian data stream, extracting damning evidence of the Scourge's lies and manipulations. Then they broadcasted, holovids of Scourge leaders sacrificing their own troops, audio logs of them planning to betray the Craxian people, documents revealing the true selfish motives behind the war. At first, nothing happened. The battle raged on, the Craxian fleet unwavering. Then a report came in, a Craxian frigate breaking formation, its crew in open revolt. Then another and another. Confusion rippled through the Craxian ranks. Ships turned on each other as loyalists clashed with defectors. The tight order of the Armada dissolved into chaos. "It's working," Niran cried. "They're turning against the Scourge." The Allied fleet seized the moment. They focused fire on the ships still flying the Scourge's colors, exploiting the disarray in the enemy ranks. The tide was turning. The once mighty Craxian Armada was fracturing, disintegrating. But the Scourge wouldn't go down easily. Fanatic to the end, they initiated a doomsday protocol. The cores of their remaining ships began to overload, building towards a cataclysmic self-destruct. "They're going to blow themselves up," Johnson yelled, "and take us with them." They had minutes, maybe less. Johnson rallied his troops for one last desperate charge. They had to reach those reactors, stop the overload before it consumed them all. They boarded the lead Scourge vessel, fighting through waves of crazed defenders. The ship shuddered around them as the core strained at its containment. In the reactor room, Johnson's team faced the final line of defense. Scourge zealots ready to die for their twisted cause. Plasma flew and blades clashed in the cramped space. Johnson took a hit to the shoulder, but pushed on, cutting down the last fanatic. The core pulsed with sickly light, seconds from detonation. Johnson lunged for the control panel, his fingers racing over the unfamiliar symbols. The light died, the shuddering ceased. With a whine of aborted power, the core shut down. They had done it, cut the head off the snake. With their doomsday plan foiled and their fleet in ruins, the surviving Scourge leaders had no choice but to surrender. The battle was over. The sector was saved. But as Johnson looked out at the scarred and shattered ships, the floating wreckage that had once been proud vessels and living crews, he knew their struggle was far from over. The Craxians had been defeated, but the wounds of this war would take a long time to heal. The acrid stench of scorched metal and burnt flesh hung heavy in the air as the Allied forces picked through the wreckage of the battle. Ships drifted, shattered husks that had once carried the hopes of a dozen worlds. The silence was broken only by the occasional hiss of a ruptured airlock or the crackle of residual energy discharges. In the heart of the devastation, Johnson and Niran stood side by side, their armor battered and stained, their faces grim. They had won, but the cost had been high. On the planet below, the remnants of the Craxian forces laid down their weapons, their will to fight extinguished with the death of their fanatical leaders. The more moderate elements, those who had chafed under the Scourge's rule, stepped forward to negotiate a peace. It was a fragile thing, born of exhaustion and desperation, but it held. The Craxian Empire, or what was left of it, agreed to withdraw, to dismantle its war machine and begin the long process of reform. For the Eliani, the humans, and their allies, the work of rebuilding began. Cities were reconstructed, populations were tended to, and the wounds of war, both physical and psychological, were slowly nursed. Johnson and Niran found themselves at the center of this effort, their names spoken with reverence by those they had saved. They were heroes, legends even, the saviors of the sector. But even as life began to regain a semblance of normalcy, a new shadow crept over the galaxy. Investigators, sifting through the ruins of the Scourge's power base, uncovered a web of connections that stretched far beyond the Craxian Empire. The Scourge, it seemed, were merely one tendril of a much larger beast, a network of fanatical cults that spanned the stars. They called themselves the Dominion, and their goal was nothing less than the subjugation of all they deemed lesser. The Dominion had been content to work through proxies, to manipulate and scheme from the shadows, but the events in the sector had drawn their eye. The gravitational weapon, born of ancient Eliani technology, was of particular interest. In the hands of the Allied forces it was a shield, a defender of the free, but to the Dominion it was an opportunity, a tool to further their dark ambitions. Even as Johnson and Niran worked to expose the Dominion's existence, to rally the galaxy against this new threat, they found themselves beset on all sides. Dominion agents, cloaked in secrecy and guile, wormed their way into the heart of the Alliance, sabotaging efforts to understand and replicate the gravitational technology. Key figures, those who had been instrumental in the fight against the Craxians, began to disappear or turn up dead, victims of the Dominion's assassins. A new kind of war had begun, one fought not with blasters and battleships, but with whispers and shadows. Johnson and Niran found themselves on the front lines once again, but this time their enemies wore no uniform, flew no flag. They were everywhere and nowhere, a phantom menace that struck without warning and vanished without trace. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As Johnson and Niran delved deeper into the mystery of the ancient Eliani technology, they discovered a truth that shook them to their core. The devices, the very things that had saved their worlds, were not of Eliani origin at all. They were relics of the Dominion, part of some long-forgotten experiment. And now the Dominion would stop at nothing to reclaim their lost secrets. The final battle, when it came, was as much a battle of wills as it was of weapons. The Allied forces, united by bonds forged in the fire of war, stood against the full might of the Dominion. Fleets clashed, soldiers fought, and worlds burned. In the end, the Alliance prevailed, but the victory was bitter. Many had been lost, and the unity that had been their strength was strained to the breaking point. Johnson and Niran, once hailed as saviors, now found themselves viewed with suspicion. Their association with the ancient technology, now known to be of Dominion origin, cast a pall over their heroism. There were whispers of hidden agendas, of secrets yet unrevealed. But for Johnson and Niran there was no rest, no respite. They knew that the Dominion, though defeated, was not destroyed. The war, the true war, was only just beginning. As they stood on the bridge of their ship, gazing out into the endless expanse of space, they knew that the fight for the galaxy's freedom would be long and hard. But it was a fight they were ready for, a fight they would see through to the end, no matter the cost. The sector had been saved, but the shadow of the Dominion still loomed, and in that shadow Johnson and Niran stood ready, warriors of light against the encroaching darkness. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. Johnson and Niran pored over the data they'd extracted from the Dominion's networks, their eyes burning from hours of staring at holoscreens. The information painted a chilling picture. "They're not just after conquest," Niran said, his voice tight with anger. "They want total control, complete domination of every sentient mind in the galaxy." Johnson felt his stomach twist as he read the details of the Dominion's plan. A psionic amplifier capable of crushing the will of entire planets, reducing their populations to mindless thralls. And at the heart of it all, the ancient Eliani technology they'd been fighting over for so long. "We have to stop them," Johnson said. "We can't let them finish this thing." They gathered their team, a motley crew of the best and brightest from across the Alliance. There was Kara, the fierce Craxian rebel who had lost everything to the Scourge, and Zen, the Eliani psionic, whose visions of a dark future drove him to fight. Together they planned their assault on the heart of Dominion space, where intel suggested the amplifier was being built. It would be their most dangerous mission yet, a desperate gamble to save the free will of the galaxy. As they made their approach, sneaking past the Dominion's defenses, Johnson couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Something about this felt too easy, like they were walking into a trap. But they had no choice. The stakes were too high, they had to push forward. The amplifier loomed before them, a monstrous construct of twisted metal and pulsing energy. Dominion troops swarmed to defend it, and the battle was joined. Laser fire crisscrossed the cavernous chamber as Johnson and his team fought their way forward. Kara was a whirlwind of blades, her grief and rage fueling her every strike. Zen's psionic blasts sent Dominion soldiers flying, their minds shattered. But the Dominion forces were relentless, and their numbers seemed endless. One by one, Johnson's team fell. He saw Kara go down, her body shielding a wounded comrade. Zen was next, consumed by a surge of psionic feedback as he overloaded the amplifier's core. In the end, only Johnson and Niran were left, battered and bleeding but still standing. The amplifier lay in ruins, its threat ended forever. But as they stood amid the wreckage, a final hologram flickered to life. The face that greeted them was human. "You have fought well," the figure said, his voice cold and imperious. "But your struggle is futile. We are the rightful rulers of this galaxy. All will submit to the Dominion's will." Johnson felt his world spin as the truth crashed down on him. The Dominion's leaders were human, his own people twisted by a mad ideology seeking to enslave the galaxy. He and Niran barely made it back to Allied space, their hearts heavy with the weight of this revelation and the loss of their friends. They were hailed as heroes, but the praise tasted like ashes in Johnson's mouth. The alliance they'd fought so hard to forge was unraveling, fear and suspicion tearing at the bonds of trust. Many now looked at humanity with distrust, wondering how many more traitors lurked among them. And Zen's final visions haunted Johnson's dreams, visions of a darkness yet to come, a threat that would dwarf even the Dominion. In the face of this uncertain future, Johnson and Niran made a difficult decision. They would continue the fight, but from the shadows. They formed a secret organization, dedicated to hunting down the remnants of the Dominion and preparing for the battles ahead. As they stepped back from the public eye, Johnson knew that their war was far from over. The galaxy had been saved, but the cost had been immense, and the future stretched before them, dark and unknown. But as long as there were those willing to fight for freedom, as long as the spirit of resistance lived on, there was still hope. Johnson and Niran would carry that flame, no matter how dark the path ahead might be. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.